In 1721, a Norwegian missionary named Hans Egede sailed into a fjord in Greenland. He had come to find the Vikings. He knew they were there. The Vatican had records of them. Tax collectors had records of them. For 500 years, there had been a thriving European civilization on the edge of the Arctic. He expected to find thousands of people. He expected to hear church bells, blacksmith hammers, and the Old Norse language. Instead, he found silence. The stone walls of the houses were still standing. The church was there. The barns were there, but the people were gone. There were no bodies, no mass graves, no signs of a giant war. It was as if 3,000 people had simply stood up from their dinner tables, walked out the door, and vanished into the thin air. This is history's greatest cold case. How does a civilization survive for 5 centuries, longer than the United States has existed, and then disappear without a trace? We finally have the answer, and it's not what you think. They didn't just leave, they were trapped. To understand how they died, you have to understand why they went there in the first place. It started with a lie. In 985 AD, Eric the Red was exiled from Iceland for murder. He sailed west and found a massive island. He called it Greenland. Historians like to joke that this was the first real estate scam in history. But here's the thing, he wasn't lying. In the year 1000, the world was warmer than it is today. The fjords of Greenland were lush. You could grow hay, you could graze cattle. Thousands of Vikings followed Eric. They built 2 main colonies, the Eastern Settlement and the Western Settlement. They didn't live like rough survivalists. They lived like European royalty. They built a cathedral of red sandstone with glass windows. They wore the latest fashions from Paris. They drank wine from the Rhine Valley. But their economy wasn't based on farming. It was based on red gold. Walrus ivory. Before plastic, before elephant ivory became common, walrus tusk was the most valuable material in Europe for carving luxury goods. The Greenland Vikings had a monopoly on it. They were the Saudi Arabia of ivory. They were rich. They were pious. They were secure. And then, the weather changed. Around 1250 AD, a massive volcanic eruption triggered a global cooling event known as the Little Ice Age. In Greenland, the effects were apocalyptic. The growing season shrank by weeks. The hay for the cows wouldn't grow tall enough. The winters got longer. But the real killer was the ocean. As the planet cooled, sea ice began to clog the shipping lanes between Greenland and Norway. In the 11th century, 3 or 4 merchant ships arrived every year. By the 1300s, they were lucky to see 1 ship a decade. The Vikings were running out of iron. They were running out of timber. And worst of all, the market crashed. Portuguese sailors opened trade routes to Africa. Suddenly, Europe was flooded with elephant ivory. It was whiter, larger, and better quality than walrus tusk. Overnight, the Greenlanders' only source of wealth became worthless. They were now poor, freezing, and isolated. And they were about to realize they weren't alone on the island. While the Vikings were struggling, another culture was thriving. The Thule people, the ancestors of the modern Inuit, were expanding south from the Arctic. The Thule were masters of the ice. They had toggle harpoons to hunt whales. They had waterproof kayaks. They wore tailored fur layered for heat retention. The Vikings called them Skrallings. We don't know exactly what happened between them, but the archaeology is dark. Around 1350, a relief party went to the Western settlement because they had stopped sending messages. When they arrived, they found nothing. The Chronicle says, they found no man, neither Christian nor heathen, only some wild cattle and sheep running around. The entire Western settlement, hundreds of people, had vanished. So, did the Inuit kill them all? Modern science says no. The bones tell a much sadder story. Forensic anthropologists have analyzed the isotopes in the bones of the Greenland Vikings from the early years versus the final years. In the beginning, their diet was 80% land-based: beef, cheese, milk. By the end, their diet was 80% marine-based. Seal meat. They were starving. They had eaten their cows. They had eaten their hunting dogs. We found the cut marks on the dog bones. And here is the most frustrating part of the mystery. The Vikings refused to adapt. We have excavated their trash piles. We found thousands of Viking artifacts. Do you know what we didn't find? Not a single harpoon, not a single kayak part. They were living next door to the masters of Arctic survival, but they were too proud, or too religious, or too European to learn from them. They would rather die as Christians than survive as pagans. The end didn't come with a scream, it came with a whimper. The last written record from Norse Greenland is a wedding in Havalsi Church in 1408. It sounds normal, people were getting married, life went on, but the ship that recorded that wedding was the last ship to ever leave. After 1410, the silence falls. Archaeologists found the body of one of the last Vikings in the eastern settlement. He wasn't buried, he was found on the floor of his house. His bones showed he was crippled by rheumatism. He was tiny, malnutrition had stunted his growth. He died alone. There was no one left to bury him. The rich, powerful men likely got on the last few ships and fled back to Iceland. They abandoned the poor, the sick, and the elderly to face the winter alone. The Vikings didn't vanish because of a war. They vanished because they couldn't let go of who they used to be. They tried to force a European lifestyle onto an Arctic world that didn't want it. When the climate changed, they refused to change with it. The mystery isn't why they left. The mystery is how they survived the darkness for as long as they did.